behalf of the East Tennessee Historical Society. My name is Lisa Oakley. I'm Vice President of the Historical Society and also Curator of Education. Danny Manley is in the back and she handles all of our education programs. If you had been here just a little while back, you would have seen a load of students going through the museum and doing great things with Charles and Judy Ogle helping as volunteers. So we have a lot of things going on here in the History Center. We're tickled to have our guest today as far as for our lecture. I know folks on Zoom can't see me, but hopefully they can hear just the introduction, which I will do here in just a moment. But we always like to, and Dr. Doctor usually is here to do the introduction. He's out today, but I'm standing in his place. I want to make sure that I mention a couple of upcoming events. That's something we always like to do when we're greeting folks that come for our brown bag lectures. We have a couple of brown bag events. Actually, one's a brown bag and one is an evening lecture. But on Wednesday, April the 26th, we'll have a program that's actually a collaborative program from other groups here in the building related to the exhibit Lights Camera East Tennessee, which I hope you'll have a chance to see at some point when you're here for programming. And it will run through the summer. But the program is Sam Goes Everywhere Films Anything, exploring Sam Orleans East Tennessee films. And that will be sponsored, though, and kind of conducted, that program will be conducted by the Tennessee Archive of Moving Image and Sound, which is here in the History Center. So I hope you'll have a chance to see the exhibit while it's running, and then if you're interested in that topic, that will be at noon on Wednesday, April the 26th. And then on Thursday, April the 27th, and we tried to do this in March, but when you hear the topic, you will find out why that might not have been a good idea. The topic, it will be in the evening at 6 o'clock, Title IX, Pat Summit, and Tennessee's Trailblazers. It's a new title out from Dr. Mary Ellen Pathel. She's a professor at Belmont in Nashville, and it's a very popular book. She's been speaking all around the state, and when she speaks, oftentimes many of those trailblazers, those women athletes, will come and attend. And we have 3 special guests that will be in kind of a discussion with her after she does a brief book talk. And those special guests are Joan Cronin, Ann Furrow, and Missy Kane. And so if you would like to hear them talk about their careers and about what Title IX has meant to the field of athletics for women, please do attend that evening for both the brief book talk and then Dr. Pathel's discussion with those individuals. So now you can see why Dr. Cronin said, well, maybe the end of March wouldn't be a good idea, depending on what happens. So she was very kind to reschedule and find a date that would work. So I hope you'll put that date on your calendar. If you don't want to write it down, if you need a reminder, we have these flyers in the back. But without further ado, oh, and also please join. I need to always say that. And there are these neat little stickers in the back that feature our Votes for Women online exhibit. Some of you all know that the anniversary for the passing of the 19th Amendment was kind of curtailed by the COVID epidemic. It was the 100-year anniversary in 2020, and so many of those events didn't get done, didn't get to commemorate those events as we would like to. So the Historical Society, through Humanities Tennessee funding, was able to pull together an online exhibit. And so if you want to grab a sticker, it has the web address for that exhibit, and we would love for you to visit and learn more. But without further ado, why are we here today? We're here to hear this wonderful discussion. Newsmakers no longer in the news with Georgiana Vines and with John North to have discussion about Georgiana's book that she recently published with UT Press, and which is also an award winner through ETHS. And Georgiana herself is an award winner as one of our favorite and most special East Tennesseans in a Lifetime Achievement Award. So congratulations to her in receiving those awards last year. But let me give you just a little bit of a bio. Georgiana Vines is a retired associate editor of the Knoxville News Sentinel, for which she still writes a political column every 2 weeks. Her career as a reporter-editor at the News Sentinel began in 1968. She has lived in Knoxville since, except for the period 1996 to 97, when edited the now-defunct El Paso Herald-Post in Texas. She was 1992-93 national president of the Society of Professional Journalists, is an ex officio board member of the East Tennessee Pro chapter of SPJ and Front Page Foundation, a past chair of the Clarence Brown Theater Advisory Board, and has taught at the University of Tennessee School of Journalism and Electronic Media. She received the Wells Key, National Society of Professional Journalists, 1996, Lifetime Achievement Award, East Tennessee Writers Hall of Fame, sponsored by Friends of Literacy, 2015, and 50-Year Club, Tennessee Press Association, 2016, and now she can add last year's award to her bio from ETHS. And with her, we have John North. Has been a journalist since 1982, starting with stints at Kansas City's morning and afternoon papers. He moved to Knoxville in 1993 to report for the Knoxville News Sentinel. In 2000, he moved to Atlanta to work for CNN for 2.5 years. He missed Tennessee so much that he moved back in 2002 to be editor-manager for the next 12 years at the News Sentinel. He's been at WBIR since 2014, working as a manager, reporter, mentor, and co-moderator of the weekly public affairs program Inside Tennessee with his friend John Becker. During his career, he's received local, state, and national journalism awards, most recently winning a regional Edward R. Murrow Award with co-worker Leslie Ackerson and a national Murrow with WBIR's digital team. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Talk about the book availability.
Oh, thank you for reminding me. I told her to do that. So we do have a few books out at the front desk. So if you would like to pick up a book for signing after the program, I know many of y'all probably already have it because it's been so well touted in the community. But if you want the book, please get that at the desk. If for some reason we run out of books, Tim would be glad to order those, and Georgiana says she will be glad to get those signed for you. So we will facilitate that for you. So thank you again for being here, and on with the show.
Thank you, Lisa. How's everybody doing today?
Great.
We appreciate you being here. We really do. It's good to see all of you. Georgiana, how's it going?
I'm glad we're here. That's all I can say. I was gone for 3 weeks and just got back a week ago. And I didn't really forget I had this going on, but all of a sudden I thought, I think I better find out what I'm supposed to be doing. So John and I are exchanging notes about what we're going to talk about. And I do want to add one other board I've recently been added to. I don't generally join boards, but I'm really happy about that one. It's the Knoxville History Project.
That is just a quick plug for the Knoxville History Project. I don't know if y'all go on YouTube at all, but that's kind of like my thing these days. It's the black hole that I jump down into, and it's endlessly fascinating. I did it a couple weeks ago, looking at a couple things that the History Project had done in terms of noteworthy buildings downtown. Fascinating evolution of downtown. Some I like, some I don't like. I highly recommend that. You can just get lost in the history of Knoxville, which is such a fascinating place. All right, we're old friends.
He was my boss for some of these stories.
I just basically said yes, whatever she was asking for. I said, yeah, that sounds good, let's do that. We work together at the News Sentinel both as colleagues and in sort of an editor-writer relationship, but really it's, we think a lot alike. She is an amazing journalist, and I've tried to sort of have the same appreciation for journalism that Georgiana does. She is a superb example of what journalism is, and she's been dedicated to it for a long time. And a lot of us look up to her because of the work that she's done and the dedication that she continues to have to this day in regards to this profession, which I hope you don't mind me saying is extremely important to our democracy. And I'm not patting myself on the back, I'm just saying, especially considering the times we live in today, I think it is more important than ever that we have strong, vital journalism. I worry about it in this town and in this state and in this country, because there are elements that would like to see us just kind of stop asking questions. And you know as well as I do that we need to continue to press, to expose. You saw what happened last week in Nashville. I probably don't need to say anything more about the importance of a free press and people like Georgiana. So let's talk about the book, okay? It's been a fascinating project. I've been able to sort of have to touch it in little ways. Some of the stories in here about people are profiles that Georgiana did while working at the News Sentinel, and sometimes, I got to sort of chime in and say, wow, that's a really cool idea, I love it, will you please go do that? And others she would say, I want to do so-and-so, and I'm like, okay, yeah, that sounds good. And there have been others that she's done, and I have a list of people that I want her to do a second book on. But she kind of laughs when I say that because she's already really busy, and it's no simple project to do something like this. This is fair to say took years.
How it started is, at one time I was doing features. I was doing Where Are They Now series in the Sunday features section. And I did that for, I don't know, 6 or 8 years, something like this. And I have a very dear friend, Fran Scheidt, who started bugging me about putting those together in a book. And I had no intention of ever writing a book. There are a lot of people who go into journalism and then they want to write books. That was not one of my goals. But Fran was bugging me so much that one day when I saw Tom Post, who's the marketing director for the UT Press, walking down Locust. I live at the corner of Locust and Clinch. I went out and talked to him, and I said, I have this friend who wants me to write this book about some of my stories. And would y'all be interested in talking to me? And he says, yes, why don't you come over and bring a list of some of the stories you'd like to include in your book. So I was assigned as the acquisitions editor, Thomas Wells, at the University of Tennessee Press. And when I walked in, the first thing he said to me is, we want you to be sure and include stories on the Smoky Mountains National Park, because my dad had been superintendent there at one time. And I had that Park Service connection, although I never lived in that park. I grew up in national parks. So I did include it in on my list. So we were all thinking alike on it. Most of the stories in this book, all but one, did appear in the News Sentinel, and they were all updated. And there's one exception that did not appear, and it's the one exception where there's also a mistake in the name, for which I'm horrified. And I'm going to admit it. It's Ann Davis, who is considered the mother of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And when I was working on the story, I did the story through a volunteer in the Park Service, Robin Goddard, who lives in Maryville. She portrays Ann Davis at events at the park from time to time, so that's how I wove it in. And when I was working on it, I started looking to make sure I was going to spell her name right, and I came across a newspaper clipping, A-N-N, so I used A-N-N. He was not one of the persons who edited that story, because it was added. He was one of the official readers for the book. I think it's all right to admit it, because I knew he'd be tough on me. Not only as having been an editor when I did a lot of the stories for the paper, but reading the book. So he hadn't seen that story, or I think he'd have caught it. And I would like to say, and I think it's been changed here, I discovered recently that the name was also misspelled in an exhibit here, but I think Doc has taken care of that, because he and I've had a conversation. So it's an easy name to misspell, but I am mortified about it. It should not be that way in this book. And instead it should be A-N-N-E, so I do want to say that. In any event, this book was published late 2019, and then we know what happened in 2020. And I was starting to have some book signings and that kind of thing when I had to stop because of COVID, and I did. And sadly, one of the things that's happened since the book was published is the number of people who are featured in it who are no longer with us. There are about a dozen of them, and there are about 45, 46 personalities in the book. And then also, in addition to the ones who are featured, are the spouses of some. And then just this week, the father of Susan Daycat died. And so I put a little note in this book. There's just one sentence about him in this book, but they are people, Arab Americans, who've made quite a contribution in this community. So I did want to mention that.
Can we jump in?
Sure.
I want to start talking about some of the people that you did profile. And I'm just going to tell you, I want to talk about one of my favorites that you ever did, selfishly speaking, because we talked about it, and you pulled it off, and I thought it was really, really cool that you did this, because I've always had a personal interest in this person and in this family, and they have had a profound influence. You mentioned the park. They've had a profound influence not only on this national park, which is our national park, but also the national park, which is in Maine. That's David Rockefeller. So how did you get David Rockefeller, who was quiet, elusive, never sought publicity? He was the youngest of the, I believe, 5 Rockefeller boys born to John D. Jr., grandsons of John D. Sr. How did you get him when he came here? How did you do that story?
I was on vacation and catching up with my email, and I believe it's the Smoky Mountain Park Association. I don't think it was Friends of the Smokies, but it was one of the 2 support groups of the Smokies. They had an item there that David Rockefeller had visited the park. And I went through the archives of the News Sentinel, and I couldn't find a story on David Rockefeller having visited the park, and I thought surely they would have had something on him, since his family, his father, made the $5 million donation, which was needed to actually acquire the park itself. So I called John and I said, David Rockefeller had been in the Smokies? No. Are you going to try and reach him? Yes. It went kind of like that.
Please do.
He was 98. Folks, he was no longer available for interviews. Also, I had to track down how I was going to find him. So I started with the Rockefeller Foundation. And what they did is they referred me to a spokesman for David Rockefeller, who's a man who lives in New Jersey, and I have to look it up because I can't think of his name right this minute. Eventually I got to him, and he said, David Rockefeller no longer grants interviews. And I could see that. But I said, I'd like to know what he thought of the park. He said, send me the questions you want to know. So I did, and this man got some answers for me about David Rockefeller's visit to the park. Now, Dal Dickmanson was the superintendent of the park at the time, and when I started working on this, he was on vacation. And so I was having a hard time getting information from the Park Service about David Rockefeller's visit, because they hadn't cleared with him any publicity, and they were reluctant to do that. But eventually, when they found out I was going to do something, they did get Dale to call me, even though he was on vacation. And from him, I found out a little bit about what David Rockefeller did while he was here. He actually stayed an extra day to go to the park's own collection of insects and whatever else they have in that, which is in the Twin Creeks area, because they have a beetle bug collection, and David Rockefeller had been collecting beetles since he was a kid, and he wanted to see the park's beetle collection.
Can you imagine a billionaire who collects beetles?
So, in talking to Dale, then I found out that Jim Hart, who's president, CEO of the Friends of the Smokies, was there for that visit. So I called Jim Hart and I said, tell me about David Rockefeller visiting the beetle collection. And this is what Jim Hart said. It was neat. It put dimensions on a piece of history of the park. The son of John D. Rockefeller Jr. at 98 is sharp and extremely inquisitive. Hart also said Rockefeller was very approachable, kind of like what you would perceive a grandfatherly type figure to be, who was interested in what is going on in the world. Hart said when the trays of specimens were pulled for him to see, he looked at them like a scientist. He was someone absorbed in his interests. Seidel said, Seidel was the man, the public relations man, Fraser Seidel, or Seidel. He said Rockefeller loved the beetle collection. he saw in the Smokies, and his own collection was one of the world's most extensive, known as the Rockefeller Collection, Coleopatra, or Patera, or however how that is pronounced.
Coleopatra.
Thank you, in Latin for Beatles. So I'd like to say that before this book came out, Rockefeller died. And one of the things I really appreciated about a copy editor the UT Press had reading this story, she was able to find that Rockefeller's own Beatle collection was turned over to Harvard, I believe is where it went. He had promised them that, and they actually got it then after his death. And so that was also added to this book. So I did check around. I was trying to see if there was any Rockefeller money coming to anything here in East Tennessee, but it all pretty much went into Maine. But I would like to say that his money, the philanthropies, through his philanthropies, they're supporting preserves in Maine, and also the Maine Coastal Heritage Trust. And my concluding statement is Rockefeller money continues to support park preservation and conservation projects in the United States, just as it did when the family helped establish the Great Smoky Mountains Park.
Just to put it in perspective, because I was thinking about this the other day, Georgiana mentioned that John D. Jr. ponied up $5 million from a family fund to help get the park going. That's the equivalent of $88–90 million today. So it, $5 million is nice. 88 or 90 is even better. That's the kind of significant amount of money that was contributed in the times to help with that park. The family, I had a personal interest in this because I worked one summer up in Maine on Mount Desert Island. Some of y'all may have been there. It's really cool. I recommend it if you can. Maybe not July and August, that's peak. May and September are amazing, but the Rockefeller family has for many generations had homes, not just one, but homes on Mount Desert Island. And I worked at a restaurant in the national park, Jordan Pond House, and I used to see David Rockefeller come in and think, whoa, that is amazing to see somebody who, love him or don't love him, just what he represented in terms of the significance of he and his family in our nation's history. It's really pretty cool. So thank you, Georgiana. I love that one. That's one of my favorite ones. You want to stay on the national park because I know it's been near and dear to your heart. You want to hit a couple other highlights?
Well, I would like to say there's another Park Service brat in the audience.
Oh, okay.
Judy Gibson back there. People may know her in other ways because she doesn't talk about her growing up in national parks as much as I do, but we lived in different parks. So I lived in three parks while I was growing up, but was associated with quite a few. I was born when my parents were at Rocky Mountain National Park, and I also lived at Mammoth Cave National Park and Everglades National Park. Then I lived 6 years in the Everglades, and growing up, that was the longest I ever lived in one place. We moved around a lot like Army brats, so that's why I call myself a Park Service brat. And when my dad came to the Smokies in the 60s, it was a dream assignment for him, but I didn't live here at the time. But I will acknowledge that one of the reasons I came to Knoxville is because my folks lived in Gatlinburg. And I moved around a lot as a young adult. I was trying to rebuild my own life when I got a job at the News Sentinel in 1968. And the managing editor told me he was hiring me because my dad was at the park. So I figured I'd stayed because of me, or at least I hope so. And I do have a section in there in which I interview living superintendents. And I have included in that one acting superintendent who was Phil Francis, because he was acting superintendent for a combination of about 4 or 5 years. And when he retired, he was superintendent of the Blue Ridge Parkway. But I felt like because during the time he was there, that he should be acknowledged, so he's in that section too, and I know there are a lot of people who know Phil. The other person I would mention who I talked with is Karen Wade, who was the first woman superintendent there, and so far the only woman superintendent there. She's now retired and lives out in the Glacier National Park area. There's a picture of her in there with her grandchildren. So that's kind of up to date. And I think that's all I'll say about that.
I just want to ask you a question about this, and you may disagree with me, but so as Georgiana or as Lisa mentioned, I moved here in the early 90s, hadn't lived in East Tennessee before, and discovered what an amazing place it is, and I don't want to leave. I'm here for the rest of my life. But one thing that always struck me and kind of bothered me about the National Park Service and what they do with their superintendents is they rotate them in and out. And I just wondered if that's always kind of chapped you at all, if you thought, why don't you just let them stay here and kind of do their career here? Or do you think it's appropriate that they rotate them in and out?
I think it depends on the park and the superintendent. I will say this, I think the selection of superintendents is very different today than when my dad was selected. I think that there's more of a tendency, probably in years past, to keep superintendents in a park for a period of time. And if there was any political pull, they could do it. I don't think it works that way today. But I have no idea what Cassius plans are, how long he's going to be there, or anything like that. People under him have been leaving. The deputy superintendent there, Clay Jordan, was there for quite some time, has now gone out to parks in California that were closed because of fires. And then Dana Sane, I'm always mispronouncing her name, who was an assistant to the superintendent and the public affairs officer, has just become the CEO of the Friends of the Smokies, and she's a pretty critical person. So they may need him for stability.
Well, and he's been there a while now,
Yes.
right? What would you say, 5 years, kind of close
I'd
to
have to
5
look
years?
it up.
I just, when he was tapped
I have a
out.
list of all the superintendents in here, I think. I
Yeah,
can look it up.
you don't have Cassius yet, but he's one you can do for book 2, right?
Well, I can add that.
Bing. No, that's not fair for me to ask you to do that, although really, please do.
I've had to
Work
think.
on book 2.
Well, let me say this. All right, so after they first tell me when I go visit them at the UT Press that they want to be sure I have stories in there about the park, the 2 readers thought the park stories were the weakest. And one, not John, thought they ought to be sent one of the support groups for them to publish. I'm not going to do that, and I don't think they would have wanted them either. So my recommendation to make them stronger was one that's Robin Gardner's story, because I knew Robin portrayed Ann Davis, which made the tie to Knoxville, got the Knoxville angling. The one person who thought they ought to, those stories should not be in the book, I really thought the book should be more Knoxville oriented versus East Tennessee. But I think John thought there should be more of a tie between Knoxville and the Smoky Park. So I had to deal with that problem. So doing the Ann Davis story was one. And then I said, I have a pretty good relationship with Lamar Alexander. I believe I can get to him because he's still a U.S. Senator then. And usually I could get to the senator through his staff. And because of his long association with the park, living right next door to it. When he grew up, he's back there now and all that. He knows more about the park than just about anybody I know. And I was able to get Lamar Alexander. And I told him, I said, now I'm doing this for my book, but I'm sure I can get a column out of it. And of course I got a column out of it too. So that worked for all of us in a way. And so the UT Press folks were very satisfied about how that was handled.
Do you want to talk any more about Lamar? He's obviously retired now, although he's still staying a little bit busy, I think. Certainly what you just said, his contributions to the park, the Foothills Parkway, which y'all have been on, will be one of his legacies,
Well,
ensuring that it gets more built out.
Well, at the time the book was published, the legislation that he passed, which gives more money for maintenance and that kind of thing, in the park, there were several senators who came together on that, has now been, it was finally approved, and that money's being spent. So that would need to be recognized. I would say he has an insect named after him up there at that Twin Creeks.
Some Democrats would agree with that.
That Twin Creeks Science Center. I think I have not been in touch with him since his wife died, but I think that I noticed that he was at a program at the Baker Center recently, so he's somebody I'd like to get back to and talk to about a variety of things, including how the Park Service is going.
Do you mind if I suggest another person I'd love for you to talk a little about who's in the book?
Who is it?
Nancy Casaubon.
Nancy Casaubon Baker. Okay, let me tell you, I tried to reach her for about 6 years while Howard was still living. It started with, there started to be a decline in the number of women being elected to Congress. There was, I can't give numbers right this minute off the top of my head, but when she was in, was kind of a record time, and then there was a decrease. It's changed again, but anyway, during the time when, for a variety of reasons, there weren't as many women being elected, I wanted to interview her on that subject. So I tried through Fred Markham, who was Senator Baker's spokesman up in Huntsville. But she didn't want to be interviewed, and I was never told this. I think it's because at the time Howard Baker was raising money for the center at UT, and I don't think she wanted to say anything inadvertently that might have affected that fundraising. After his death, John called me and he said, "Can you find out what Nancy Casaubon Baker's going to do?" I said, "I will try." So I called him. Oh, I've got to tell you how I got their home phone number. So
she loves phone numbers, by the way. If she doesn't have yours, she's probably going to get it.
Yeah, I asked Rick Goodman.
And then I call her and I'm like, I'm trying to reach so.
Okay. So Ted Kennedy died, and John wanted me to call and get comment from Howard Baker about Ted Kennedy. So I gave him his law office up in Huntsville. And he said, "Well, who you need to talk to is Nancy. They were on this labor committee together. Here's the number." So I kept it.
She keeps everything.
So when he wanted me to call to see what Nancy was going to do, so I call up there, and Tom Griscom answers the phone. Tom Griscom is retired. He was Senator Baker's right-hand person at the White House. But he also was very associated with China at the Times Free Press, retired from there now. So he answered the phone, and he said, "Well, you know, you're not the only one trying to reach her." And I said, "I suspected that." And he says, "I'm taking the phone calls." I didn't hear back from Congress. So after a couple weeks, I tried the number again, and I did get her, and she was getting ready to go on a trip. And she said, "Why don't we talk at another time?" So that's essentially what we did, and that's how I got to her. I first interviewed her just on the phone, but then the News Sentinel sent a photographer up there to get pictures, and I decided to go with him, Paul Eford. And I was so glad I did.
Was that for the auction, for the preview?
Well, that's what came out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, several things came out of it. Then I found out they were auctioning off his sports cars and that kind of thing. So it just kind of went from there, but she was really easy to interview. I mean, she's used to dealing with the press. I mean, her dad had been governor of Kansas, and she'd just been around the press all of her life, so it didn't bother her to talk to me. She was totally, very comfortable with it. All right, we're getting ready to leave, and Sissy Baker walks up, drives in. She's up there trying to help settle her dad's estate. So I said, you know, I'm doing this feature series in the News Sentinel. Where are we now? I'd like to do one on you. She said, you do the story on Nancy, and then we'll talk. So we did the story first on Nancy. Then I did the story on Sissy Baker, and several months later. And I will bring up that in updating my book, Sissy Baker became the most difficult person to try to get a hold of, because I knew she'd gone on a different career path than what she had been when I wrote the original story in the News Sentinel. She was, her background is in television news producing.
She once worked at CNN.
But I had heard from someone at the Baker Center that she had now become a counselor for women in addiction. Well, I could not do that. I could not update that story without talking to Sissy Baker. So originally, my manuscript was turned in without the Sissy Baker story. And so after Bob Corker retired, there was a Q&A with him at the Baker Center. And I thought I would go and hear what Bob Corker had to say. And it turns out that the Baker board had met there that day, and Sissy Baker was there. And so I went up to her and I said, I've got to talk to you. And I talked to several of the other board members. I said, I've got to talk to her. Help me get this. So I finally got to talk to her and get the story on her working with women who were in addiction. And she acknowledged that, I mean, it came out during Senator Baker's career, when at one time he was being considered for vice president, that her mother, Joy Baker, had a drinking problem. And so Sissy acknowledged that she too had it. She believes it's in the genes and this kind of. I got a great story from her that ran in the News Sentinel before it was in my book.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've appreciated about the relationship you sort of developed with Sissy Baker, was that you were able to sort of pull back the curtain on some of that. And she's a pretty frank person.
Yeah, she is.
I have a dear friend who used to work under her and said, oh, she was tough to work for some days. But an amazing person with fascinating history. I just wanted to sort of close the loop on Nancy Cassabaum. And I love this, you talk about this in your book. When she married Howard in the 90s, she took his name and became Nancy Cassabaum Baker. Then after Howard died in 2014, she moves back to Kansas because she's a Kansan. You understand that. And she resumed calling herself Nancy Cassabaum. She is 90 years old. She is still alive. She lives on a ranch in Kansas, in kind of the middle of nowhere, Kansas, which is a large part of Kansas. I can say that because I used to live there, and I was just there last week, and it's actually a beautiful state, but there's like Topeka and Johnson County and Wichita, and then good luck. It's a vast, flat expanse, which has its own beauty. But I've always been fascinated by that fact that she went back to the ranch, and she has, you might even, if you still got her phone number, you might give her a buzz, because she's done some really interesting things from a political perspective lately, like she endorsed the Democrat who is now the governor of Kansas, who has done some really fascinating things. And Nancy Cassabaum has also she has not spoken very kindly of our 45th president, and who is of her party. And she also has been, I think, speaking out on behalf of LGBTQ.
I think that's why she didn't want to be interviewed by Howard Baker, was trying to raise money. And I think that she was from her own political, a moderate Republican, and she just didn't want to hurt anything regarding that. So,
just fascinating. I've always enjoyed the fact that you got that interview and developed that relationship. This book has so many other fascinating people. We are blessed because there are so many interesting people who have been here, worked here, helped it come along, and who are still here today. Who is another person that you want to talk about?
Well, I could talk about my interview with Mary Lynn Majors. I interviewed her while Johnny Majors was still living in their house off of Alcoa Highway. And it was so neat to go out there because he was there. I'd arranged it with her. What my angle with her is that she was very active in the Flower Guild at St. John's Cathedral, Episcopal Cathedral, and they used to have lunches and other events there during the Dogwood art season, but she was very much a part of a flower festival that they had there, and became quite well known in the gardening world for it, and when they had lived in Pennsylvania, did a lot of the same kind of work. So I thought she'd make an interesting story. So I get out there, and Johnny's there, and he says, "Now you've come to interview her, right? You don't need to talk to me." I said, "That's right." "Except will you stay so I can take a picture?" Because he told me he wanted to leave. So then I got a picture of them, and in the picture, which is in the book, she's telling him how she arranges flowers and all this, and he's looking very attentively. And I just loved his support of her. I just want to tell you that, because she's outspoken, but she's shy too, and so I enjoyed that experience very much.
Yeah, I learned a whole lot about, of course, everybody knows about Coach Majors. He was a fantastic presence, has been for UT football for decades, starting in the 50s when he played for the Vols and should have won the Heisman. But to learn more about his wife, I thought was always kind of, actually in a way, a better way to get to know who he was, because he loved her so dearly.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let me ask you the question that I didn't prepare you for. It's really not a hard question, but of all of these people in here, you get to pick two to have dinner with. Who do you have dinner with?
Oh my.
Because a meal is always an awesome time to sit down and get to know somebody.
Okay, I have to look and see who I wrote. I think I'd like to have dinner with John Cullum again.
Oh, yeah.
He's a man in his 90s, and I don't know what he's doing right now, and I sure would like to know, so I'd like to. I think he would be one.
And one more.
Well, let's see here. I think I'm going to pick, that's a tough question. I think I'm going to pick Tipper Gore.
Tipper Gore. All right, so let's talk about those two people. And here's a question I would ask. John Cullum, obviously, you all know, he went through UT and is very well known on Broadway, and also was in Northern Exposure, if you remember that show. He played Holling, wonderful actor. Still, I think sometimes hosts people from here when they go on the Clarence Brown Theater trips.
Yeah, he's been very supportive.
You get to visit John in Manhattan. And Tipper Gore, who was also, you talk about elusive interviews, she was kind of tough for you to talk to, right? And she's had an interesting journey because a really fascinating woman who was an independent person in her own right when she met Al Gore. Extremely well educated, came from a great family, was a photographer. And then her life kind of changed in significant ways.
Well, as far as I know, the Gores are still legally separated but not divorced, which was the case when I did this story in this book. And I have to really stop and think about her. She has built her own life in California, primarily, not exclusively, because she's got family in Virginia too. She came to Nashville for a fundraiser, so that was a way for me to get into talking with her. And So in setting it up, I was not supposed to bring up politics. You know, that's kind of tough. But she did. So we kind of went from there. But she's definitely just become her own person. That's all I can say.
I think that's just really interesting. I'm one of these people that I looked at she and Al, and I thought, well, that's a couple, they're going to be around forever, you know. You just figured, you know, she could have been first lady, right? I mean, however many votes out of Florida, she might have been our first lady. Well, that didn't happen. It's just one of those weird things about history, but she was always just kind of her own person, kind of like Michelle Obama or Laura Bush. It just really sort of, you know, was her own person, and I've always been intrigued by her, but she kind of pulled back a little bit.
Yeah, I'd like to catch up with her.
Let me ask you a couple more questions, and then I would hope some of y'all might have some things that you would like to know. Who have you always really wanted to get, and despite the fact that you have superpowers when it comes to tracking people down, you haven't gotten there yet?
Go to the next question. I think it might be. You mean for a future, something in a book or anything?
While you were kicking around this one and doing those profiles for the News Sentinel. She got Caroline Kennedy, by the way, which I thought was awesome, even though Caroline's not in the book.
Yeah, I talked to Caroline Kennedy about a woman by the name of Marie Cirillo, who was a Glenmary nun and then left the order and came to, what is it? Clairfield,
sorry.
And
way up in the
still
country.
lives there as far as I know. Well, you know, we have some interesting, we have an interesting congressional delegation at this time. And it's not as always easy for the press to get to people like it used to be. And so I think that one person I'd like to spend more time with sometime is actually Bill Hackman.
Bill Haggerty, one of our two current Tennessee senators. I will just tell you that, at least for my station, WBIR, it's been profoundly difficult to get either of those two people to talk. Can't get them.
But you can see why.
When Marcia was running, she made herself available. But since then, I think the strategy is don't talk to the mainstream media. Talk to Fox or Newsmax or whatever that other one is. But we continue to have, if any of y'all have Marcia Blackburn's phone number, share it with us. We'll give her a ringy ding because we would love to have her on Inside Tennessee. We'd like to interview her. She is a senator. That would be nice. What about Bob Corker? I think he'd be a good one if you did a future profile.
I could get to him.
He's a really, really interesting, smart man. Retired from the Senate, you know, former Chattanooga mayor, fascinating guy. At one point, potentially could have been Secretary of State in the Trump administration. And I'll be honest with you, I'll just make this personal observation. We had Senator Corker on for an Inside Tennessee taping one night, and I pulled him aside and I said, you would do a terrific job as Secretary of State. And he's like, well, we'll see. Of course, it didn't happen. I think he's totally relieved it didn't happen because we know how long cabinet people stayed in the Trump administration, about as long as 30 minutes, and that was it. Anybody else you'd like to get? You know, if you did another book, what do you think about, like, I don't know, Mary Costa maybe? I thought she'd be interesting.
These
Madeline
are not all
would
the
be
stories
good.
I've ever read. These are just stories that have occurred pretty much in the last 10 years.
Natalie Haslam. I think Natalie Haslam would be a good one.
And there's some that I did stay away from for a variety of reasons. We can talk about the Haslams, actually. I was trying to get people that were pretty much formally in the news, but not exclusively. But so That's one reason that the Haslam's are not in here. I started with some basic stories I might have done on some of them, but not all of them. And I certainly have covered Big Jim for decades. I don't know whether they want me in this book. They want them in my book. But there would be a lot of people throughout my whole career that I could certainly add to this. There's no question about that.
Well, let me tell you, I would lobby you to see about doing something on Natalie, because she's really interesting, and she's a fascinating figure in that family. That's a significant family in East Tennessee. I don't have to tell you that. And she has been her own driving force in some of their philanthropy, including obviously the School of Music. This might be a good time for us to pause and say, we welcome any questions you have or observations, any thoughts you might have about the book, or you can pick her brain. She's got amazing institutional knowledge about East Tennessee. Yes, sir, you.
Yeah, you said you started at the Sentinel in the late 60s?
68.
Now, the newspaper business industry, it's always been a rugged sort of male bastion. Do you notice any sexism in the newsroom, any underhanded remarks, any fanny slapping or anything like that?
Is this a planted question, Georgiana? Because, am I correct, you were hired to work for the women's
I started
section?
my career in the women's section of the Miami Herald. Herald.
Oh, okay.
Which honestly is so patronizing and condescending.
But I've got to tell you this. I'm going to tell you what it was. It was in 1961. It was one of the most outstanding feature sections in the country.
That's the Miami Herald?
That's correct.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay.
Because, see, I lived in Florida. That was my first job. And let's see, what?
Follow up?
Yeah.
Okay, so you wrote a women's column in the 60s, 61 in Miami?
Yeah, I'll tell you what I did. I covered women's clubs.
Okay,
That was my first beat.
61. Did you notice any difference in you and your profiles or the people you profiled throughout the civil rights 60s?
That's another question. So, let me talk a little bit about my career, and the answer to that is yes, because during some of that civil rights turmoil, I was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and so there were people from there who came south to help facilitate that. But I'm not quite sure where to go with your question.
Did you notice any changes in you and your approach towards profiling women?
When I came here, let me tell you why they hired me. We could start with that. My dad was superintendent of the Smoky Mountains National Park. And so the managing editor of the paper said, well, I see you've done this, and I see you've done that. Well, we've been trying to figure out how to cover the park more and Gatlinburg and all of that. So I was hired because of my dad, okay? But then I started getting all kinds of really interesting news assignments and all of that. Now, it's a tough world at my age. It's much easier today for women not to be pigeonholed into women's departments, covering women's clubs and things like that. Is that what you're... But, I am a very tenacious person. And so if I wanted a job or I tried out for city editor, didn't one time, that kind of thing. You just stay after the goals. That's all you can do.
Okay.
But newspapering has changed a lot, and there are more women in management and getting really responsible positions than ever, but you also have to realize how much it's changing, and they're doing a different kind of journalism. And I can't do all of the stuff that they're doing today. Okay?
As you were talking, I hadn't thought about this before, but it sort of reminded me of the career arc of Barbara Walters. I mean, she was sort of shunted off to do a lot of that kind of, she was kind of the women's reporter for NBC, which again is a very patronizing thought today. But you know, look at the amazing mark she left on the profession as well. Would it be, there's some story about you and mini skirts at the News Sentinel. Is that right? Did you guys just suddenly decide, because there was some kind of
No, what it was we were going to wear pantsuits.
Pantsuits.
Oh.
And they were like not allowed, and but
right.
but
everybody did it on one day.
One
They
day
just
you all
gave it.
just decided we're
And
gonna
the
do it?
managing editor sat there and said, I can't believe it. I can't believe it. We started wearing pantsuits.
kudos to you for that. Kudos to you for that. And sometimes that's
There probably
probably,
were some short skirts later.
it's just, again, kind of the archaic way we used to think about men
gosh.
and women and what the job duties ought to be. We look at it and think about it as being ridiculous today, but it's the way it was. Does anybody else have a question? We welcome your questions. Yes, ma'am.
What's your father's name?
George Bryant.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Georgiana, I have a question about how you would go about contacting people, say in the 60s or 70s. I mean, it must be very different from today. So I was reading a book about by Victoria Price recently, Vincent Price's daughter. She was talking about that people will be able to contact him. Even Jack Neely actually wrote to Vincent Price, I think, in the 80s, trying to ask him a question. He was telling me it was easier to get people's numbers back then. Do you have anything to share about that?
I just work the phone a lot. The other thing you have to do in the news business, you have to get out of the office. And you have to go to where people, your sources are. So I covered city government at one time, and that's now the Duncan Law School, But I walked every day, didn't matter if it was raining, sun was out, whatever, to go to City Hall to cover City Hall. You have to get out and meet people. But I work the phone a lot. I am very good at that.
You're a great networker.
And I'm, as John said, and I'm a good phone collector, phone number collector. I can get a hold of a lot of people. I was going through my list the other day, and I was wondering what they were doing now, but I didn't delete them because what if I need it?
Don't ever delete them. I'll tell you another sort of mechanism that we used to use, which Georgiana will appreciate, Paul, which is if you remember the old city directories. That used to be, and the phone book, those used to be profoundly valuable ways. They've gone away, but it used to be you would have a directory and somebody would go house by house or even apartment by apartment and find the names of the people who lived there. We weren't so mobile back then.
I have an old phone book in my shelf next to my desk, and it is amazing some of the numbers that still work.
Yeah.
I'll just tell you, I've held on to it as one of my resources.
When I was a young reporter, sometimes if there were like a fire, if you heard about a fire on the scanner or a shooting or whatever, or you were just trying to track somebody down, you could use the directory, which had reverse means of sort of checking streets, and there would be phone numbers and names and addresses. And the way we would work it is, for example, Georgiana as well, is if you wanted to sort of talk to the neighbors, you would find out where somebody in particular lived, and then you would start calling their neighbors. You'd be like, hey, yeah, I'm calling from the newspaper. What's going on there? We hear maybe there's something happening next door to you. And off they would go. Seriously, that's how you worked it. It's sad today because everybody has this, and those don't get reported so well, so they've kind of, the ability to really kind of get people has gone away. Sometimes there's a lot of luck involved. It is 12:59 by my iPhone, courtesy of Apple. So I suppose we ought to stop talking, although we could certainly keep going. We appreciate you taking the time to listen.
Hey, I tell you, at least one person I'll have in my next book if I do it.
Your next book. See, we've made progress.
Rick Emmett.
Oh, Rick Emmett, yes.
Yes, downtown coordinator. I start with a story or stories I already had and then go from there. And I felt like I had a really good interview with him as he was retiring. I don't know how he felt about it, but he's here today. Maybe he's here to throw tomatoes at me or something. You know? But I do want to mention him because I think he would be perfect in another.
I agree.
Yeah.
And maybe he'd sort of tell you some of the secrets that he didn't want to reveal while he was a city employee. Rick Emmett, immense respect to Rick Emmett, a Kentuckian who used to be a coal miner. We talked about one of the most dangerous and thankless professions in the United States. You bet. Y'all, we appreciate you taking the time to listen to us. And if you haven't bought a book, be sure to buy a book.
She's got a few, as I understand.
At the front desk.
And I'll hang around if anybody buys one and you want me to sign it. I'll be here a little while. Okay? All right.
Thank you.